Thanks everyone for coming. I think we're about to begin. Very happy to have this conversation tonight to discuss this important new book. The book is about big questions and big issues. It makes bold assertions. I'll quote a little bit from the introduction. The state is about to change. A revolution is in the air, driven partly by the necessity of diminishing resources, partly by the logic of renewed competition among nation states, and partly by the opportunity to do things so much better. This fourth revolution in government will change the world. So they're aiming high. And the book's been praised by a lot of people. I saw right before I came up, Tyler Cowen gave it a strong recommendation, and lots of other people have as well. So we're very happy to have the authors, John Micklethwait and Adrian Wooldridge, here with us. Mr. Micklethwait is the editor-in-chief of The Economist. After studying history at Magdalen College, Oxford, he worked as a banker before joining The Economist as a finance correspondent in 1987. He was named as editor's editor by the British Society of Magazine Editors in 2010. And Mr. Wooldridge is The Economist's management editor, and he writes the Schumpeter column. He was previously the Washington bureau chief based here in Washington, D.C. We're very honored to have you here, and thanks so much for being here. We're looking forward to a great discussion. My colleague, Dr. Stan Voiger, will moderate it. He is a resident scholar at AEI. He studies political economy, and his research has been published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. He writes frequently for popular audiences and is a regular contributor to The Hill, The National Interest, U.S. News and World Report, and AEI Ideas. So he spends basically all of his time doing that, apparently. Before joining AEI, he was a teaching fellow at Harvard, and he is a board member of the Netherlands American Foundation in Washington. I think this is unusual for the American Enterprise Institute that all three people on the stage are not American. So that's another reason to be happy that we're all here today. So I'll turn it over to Stan.
Thank you, Mike. Well, that's why we gave you 45 seconds. I'm surprised you didn't talk about Kansas and how Superman is from there and Eisenhower. Yeah, I know. I know there's one non-fictional important person who's from Kansas. Welcome to you all. First, a couple of quick administrative announcements. You'll have the opportunity to buy books outside after the event, or if you can't control yourself right now, I'm sure the authors will be happy to sign them as long as you don't get in between them and the bar. Beyond that, well, I'm going to talk to them for a little bit, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions from the audience. So as Mike just said, your book is focused on a fourth revolution in I guess, national governance mostly. What you describe in the book is, I guess, a brief overview of the role of the state in the West. But there was a first revolution that led to the establishment of nation states, sort of inspired by Hobbes's claims that the world is horrible and we need to stand together to protect ourselves. That was followed by, once, I guess, these nation states had developed the capability to defend themselves and rule themselves, sort of a process, I guess, as described by John Brewer in The Sinews of Power, you get to the point where you have a liberal state that does, rule of law, basic administrative functions, sort of the ideal of Mill. But as the state went accumulating resources, it saw the opportunity to do more. You end up with a social welfare state in the 20th century that gets its own dynamic and escalates a little bit. And then we get to the point where people like Thatcher and Reagan want to roll back some of the excesses, some of the sort of more bloated aspects of national government. But that revolution is not completed. And that's where the fourth revolution comes into the picture. What is the fourth revolution?
Well, just to say one thing first, when our thank you all very much for having us. When our publisher read our book and said, this book, the key target audience for this is the intelligent conservative, which he said somewhat questioningly. When we came here, we immediately sought out the AEI, but there is an element of truth in that. It's an attempt to try and say to people, the centre, particularly also from the right, that there is an answer here to a lot of the questions. What is the fourth revolution? The fourth revolution is the idea that government will be reformed again. We find it very, very unlikely. If you look at the midterm elections, people are going to troop off to the polls, just as they are in Europe at the moment, with a kind of discordant apathy. And the discordant apathy will be as follows. They all hate their government in different measures, and yet they all expect nothing to change. And the argument here is that that is actually, if you look at history, as you were just saying, the least likely outcome. Out of all the things which are least likely, you look back in 20, 30 years, it's the idea that government is not going to change, because history tells you that government does change. That's the reason why the West got ahead of Asia, is it kept on changing. In this particular case, it's going to be pretty much the same two reasons. It's going to change, firstly, because the West is going to run out of money. Added $14 trillion worth of debt just since the financial crisis, or some of them on government debt balance sheets. All the demographic stuff people here know very well. But also, actually, fundamentally, because we think there is a more positive reason, is that technology is going to make the state change, just as it did before. The welfare state came in because of Henry Ford, because people could imagine that there was a new way to do government. You now have the internet, you have a wide variety of things, and yet you have the most out-of-date government. You have, part of it is in an agricultural age. You still have a government where the school's calendar is set by the agricultural timetable, where you spend the whole summer, your children are supposed to go and work on the harvest. I don't see anyone here who's necessarily choosing to do that. It's an insane system. Another huge part of it is still in the industrial level. It's where Henry Ford, the state which tries to do everything just like Henry Ford did. Henry Ford used to own Michael Brown will remember this from Detroit, he used to own the fields on which grazed the sheep whose wool went into the seat covers of cars. Again, American government tries to do way too much. And finally, a lot of it is just stuck in the 70s. It has not been updated in the same way as the private sector has. So if you believe that, if people really think the government is not going to go through a big change, I think that is highly unlikely.
So I guess a logical follow-up, and a question I had sort of throughout the book is whether this fourth revolution you're announcing and the form it'll take, whether what you're doing is describing the future or prescribing the future you prefer.
Well,
some elements are clearly descriptive, right? You say things like there's pressure from above through globalization. There's pressure from below, from the people and their discontents. But some other parts I feel are also prescriptive in the sense that you're saying, well, look, there's these other models and there are things we don't like about them, and we better, make sure we get our way.
We're clearly in the book trying to do both. We're saying there's a huge pressure for reform that's coming from bankruptcy, demographic change. We're saying there's a huge opportunity to do things better because of new technology. And we're saying there are lots of examples of improvements in the way that the state operates. You can see many examples in New York or in California, across this country, of really vital innovations in improving public services. But we're also saying prescriptively that we need to go further. We can't just have a bunch of management changes or technological changes. We need to have an answer, a new answer to the big question of what is the state for? That all of these previous revolutions, the revolution of the early modern period, 16th and 17th century, was what is the state for? It must, at its basis, provide security. In the early modern period, what is the state for? It must, as its basis, provide accountability and liberty. What is the state for in the welfare era was it must provide minimum national services. We think that you could gather together all of these technological and managerial changes and really drive through a fourth revolution if people will rally round, ask and answer this question, what is the state for? And we think it's for much less than we're now giving away.
I think one bit should be non-ideological. It should be in everybody's interest, both left and right, to deliver the best possible services to people for the minimal cost. And actually, I think in some ways that poses a bigger question for the left than the right, because the right generally doesn't want to provide as much, but the left has this basic choice. Do you try and provide services to the poor, or do you try to serve your masters in the public sector unions? But don't get us wrong, I think the right has really hard questions. Why on earth is American conservatives supporting tax exemptions for things like mortgage interest relief? So more money goes to the top 5% in terms of mortgage interest relief than goes to the bottom 50% in social housing. That is insane, and it needs to be rethought about what exactly the state is for. But one half of it should be fairly apolitical. It should be these are delivering things in the most modern, accountable, clever way possible. But then the second bit, there is a big question, and that goes back to these thinkers, to Locke, to Hobbes, to Mill, to all these main ones, and that is, what kind of state do you want? And in general, our answer, I'm going to use a terrible word at the AI, is a liberal one. It's a liberal one in the British sense of the word. We would rather have a state that was based around liberty, whereby the individual gets as much freedom as possible. And if you want an example of the people you should be rushing out to celebrate, it should be people like John Stuart Mill and William Gladstone, because the really interesting thing is in the 19th century, Victorian liberals took, when Britain was the superpower, they took the British state, and between 1815 and 1846, the level of public expenditure went down from £80 million to £60 million. Now that is at a time when they added schools, they added hospitals, they added a police force, they added the sewer system. They built up government in one way, but they ripped out cronyism. They ripped out all the exemptions, all the stuff which loads of Republican congressmen and senators are too cowardly to do. They did all that stuff. They did this at a time when Britain was running a huge empire. They did it at a time when the population was increasing by 50%, but they actually cut the state. And if you want a lesson on how to do that, go and look at people like William Gladstone, go and look at people like John Stuart Mill. That was the thing they championed. And that type of revolution is what we personally believe in. But there is the first one, which is just purely managerial and technological.
And so if you think of that, I guess that apolitical half of the book today, what are the kind of reforms that you've seen that have worked, in roles that are, generally seen as a part of the social welfare state? What are programs that you think of?
Well, let me give you an example from a country not too far from your own native country, which is Sweden. From 1945 to 1993, every question in Sweden had the answer, more government. And every question of how you fund it also had the same answer, just raise taxation levels. So you had government rising to about 67% of GDP, taxation levels for the people at the top rising to about more than 100% of their basic income. An astonishing situation. And what happened in the early 1990s, because of a big economic crisis, was the Swedes basically concluded that they'd reached the limits of big government. They had to row back. So they reduced the size of the state, which is now about 49% of GDP. They reduced top rates of taxes by about 27 percentage points. They simplified their tax code. They had a big look at their entitlement program, and they balanced it. They raised the retirement age. They changed the contributions that people were making into pensions so that their government entitlement program is balanced for a long period ahead. But most interestingly and most importantly of all, they changed the way that they delivered their welfare services. They came to the conclusion that in order to provide welfare services free, you don't have to own everything that you're providing. You don't have to own the sheep in the field. So they said, everybody should have a school voucher. Milton Friedman's great voucher idea was not realized in the United States, it was realized in Sweden. Everybody has the right to send their children to whatever school they want. They said, why can't we have private companies running public schools? So they have lots of private companies running public schools. They have private equity companies running chains of schools. They have exactly the same in the hospital sector. I went to a hospital in the middle of Sweden. It's a public, in Stockholm, it's a public hospital. But it's run by a private equity company called Capio. All services are free at the point of delivery, but the private equity company is putting money and getting profits out of this hospital. And one of the ways that they achieve efficiencies is by using management techniques, which the public sector doesn't use. They use a system of lean management, just-in-time production, all these ideas taken from the manufacturing sector in China. And one of the things they've discovered is if you have doctors who are employees of a company, they will tend to be much more willing to adopt new management ideas that come from outside. Whereas if they're a professional guild, they'll be very resistant to the spread of ideas. They've found that they can spread ideas much more quickly. They've also found that they have hospitals right across Europe. So because they're an international company, they can spread good practice, cost-saving practices across Europe. Now, this is Sweden. This is socialist Sweden. This is the very center of socialist Europe. Why is it that a formerly socialist country, a big government country, could still be much more adventurous, much more imaginative, much more innovative in the way that it delivers public services than the United States?
Why do you think it is?
I think it's because they have managed to make they're producing a post-ideological government, a government that's in which both parties are willing to accept some of the ideologies of the other. So the right has said, yes, we accept the idea that there must be a universal welfare state, there must be a basic basis of provisions which we won't go beyond. And the left has said, but we will also accept the virtues of market mechanisms, business practices to deliver those services. So they're reaching towards not only a post-big government future, but a post-ideological future in which they put aside a lot of their ideological divisions. How they implement it, I went to a sort of summer camp for politicians they have in Visby. Every year they all go, the whole lot of them, they go and they jog together and they exercise together and they play tennis together and they discuss big issues like demographic change in a sort of non-partisan environment. And I can just imagine the Democrats and the Republicans going off to Cape Cod or wherever and spending this summer camp together working out.
So that's a positive outcome, an optimistic scenario. Many of the same pressures that led to that in Sweden, sort of a fiscal crisis, popular discontent, you see nowadays in Greece and Spain and Portugal and Italy to, if anything, a more extreme extent. Do you think that similar developments will occur there or not? Why wouldn't they? Is it because they no longer have the kind of nation state that allows for people to come together that way? Are there other reasons why?
Well, I'll answer that. I think there are confusing things there at work. You've got now the much bigger importance of the European Union, which gets in the way of quite a lot of these things. I think you have seen, and I wouldn't stress this too much, in various parts of Southern Europe, you have actually seen fairly extreme changes compared with what happened before. A country which has not changed at all is France, but actually look and see what Italy's done on pensions. You can see really quite systematic changes in places like Spain. But I would argue you can see the same thing in America. You look at California. California seems to be the empire of dysfunction. It's got a little bit more functional recently, whatever one thinks of Jerry Brown. There has been at least an attempt by people who have got together to try and work out what exactly this government should be doing. So the one pressure is very simple: you go bust. That's really simple.
And I guess that's happened at the federal level to some extent too, where at least in the short run, most fiscal problems are much more manageable now than they looked 4 years ago.
They were, but same token, you look at what happens with Simpson Bowles. That was at least an attempt. Everyone in America shades towards beginning to deal with some of these problems, but then pulls away from it. When Barack Obama, probably again the wrong audience to say this to, when Barack Obama looks back, which I'm sure he will from some wonderful sainted place, when he looks back on his presidency, I think possibly rejecting Simpson Bowles will be almost the thing he rejects most at home, because that was a real opportunity to change things in a much more dramatic way. In fact, what will happen is people will look back on this period as one where everything was still wildly out of control.
I mean, he'll probably just say that was Bush's fault.
He will, but in the end, if you're president, you carry there is a profound failure. How do you change these things? You change it because you have a crisis sometimes. You change it in other cases because a leader comes and emerges and grabs hold of things. Some things are very, very unlikely. In the book, I tell a story about when I'm age 19 and I go to San Francisco on my gap year. Michael Brown's had the story before. And I'm set to go and stay with an Englishman who actually had something to do with the founding of this place, called Anthony Fisher, who was a cousin of the man who I was traveling around with. We arrived and we went off to sauna with his mad friend who's called Milton. 1980, I sat there and listened to this demented man telling me, an Englishman who just left his school in Yorkshire, where we had to be taught by candlelight because the miners had been on strike. He told me that Margaret Thatcher was going to come in and she was going to privatize the whole of, she's going to start selling off British telecommunications, she's going to sell off the British Rail, she was going to start introducing education vouchers, she was going to tame inflation. I just thought this man was completely demented. And I went to go and watch The Grateful Dead later that week, and I thought that whatever hallucinogenic drugs they were on were comparatively minor compared with this other man who was called Milton Friedman. But the lesson to me, and you might argue that a 19-year-old Briton should have known more about who Milton Friedman was, is that things can change. I mean, as we say, the Reagan-Thatcher revolution didn't change everything, but it did change quite a lot.
They did. But so far, I guess what we've discussed is the West, broadly speaking. In your book, you do focus a lot on sort of alternative routes of development. You talk about China, Singapore, quite a bit. But you do ultimately, I guess, dismiss those models. both normatively, but even I feel positively. I don't think I don't think Thomas Friedman would agree with that. But what do you think the big problems on the horizon are for, say Singapore and China?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that for the first time, the West really confronts an alternative model that actually might work. From 1600 onwards, the West has been the center for the invention and the reinvention of the state. All the good ideas, all the great innovations have been here. For the first time, that's
mostly from the Netherlands.
Have been in,
Most of them, yeah.
Britain had its role, but and later the United States did some good things. But really, what you see now with the model that you have in China is two big challenges to Western values. One is state capitalism, which argues that the state can run, invest in companies, make long-term decisions, not by owning the companies, not by directing everything that they do, but by acting as a shareholder. By acting as a shareholder in those companies, it can combine the best of capitalism with the best of sort of long-term planning in their view. And they've created some very formidable, very successful companies by that process. And the second challenge that it's raised is the challenge of sort of meritocracy. Instead of our model of democracy and frequent elections, what they do is to try and have top-down government in which they select people very, very carefully for the top jobs and give them those top jobs for 10 years. We've never seen an autocracy before like this, where people are kicked out by a routine, regular process every decade or so. Most autocracies die because the autocrats take over and they won't go. They're there forever until they get old and demented. But this is a routine passage of power from one generation to the other. They also have, across the system, performance-related sort of contracts. So all the governors of states are given their job for 3 or 4 years and told that these are your targets, you must hit them. So I think it's really important to understand that the Chinese and other models that Singapore is part of that, really are confronting the West with the first biggest challenge that it's ever had. And in order to defeat that challenge, as I hope we will, we need to get a bit fitter. We need to go to the gym. We need to go to the sauna after the gym. We need to work out a bit more. And I think democracy, in particular, the democracies of the West, have become rather self-indulgent and rather flabby by having governments that are too big, that try to do too many things, that aren't properly focused, that are the victim of too many interest groups. They're actually weakening the power of democracy. They're creating a sort of democratic distemper, I think, whereby on the one hand people look to the government to solve their problems and welcome the government, ask the government to do more things, then feel discontented that the government doesn't solve their problems better. And what we argue is that in order for democratic values, liberal values, to triumph over the next century in the war with this top-down guardian state of China, we need to have smaller, more focused states, not just because they're economically more efficient, but also because they actually create a better democracy and they're better purveyors of liberal values. But it's a real contest that we're in. It's not like with the Soviet Union. It's something that's much more profound and difficult, I think.
Okay, so I think that, there's just sort of outside of the West or in non-traditional Western nation states, you've seen quite a lot of this. In the Arab Spring, you're seeing it in Turkey, you've seen it in Thailand, in Brazil now, but also surrounding the European Union, you see these governments that never really reached the stage of a full-fledged democracy with a set of roles that's too wide. But you do see a lot of popular discontent. How do you think that settings like that, I understand that I just listed a pretty broad variety of settings, but how do you think that in settings like that, the governance institutions that exist right now, how do you think they will develop? How do you think they will respond to popular pressure?
I think there's something of a contest going on again there, actually. But what you look at the history during the later part of the 20th century, democracy won pretty much every kind of close battle. Russia, all these different ones, they all turned democratic. You look at the first 10, 15 years of this century, it's been exactly the other way around. Egypt looked like it could be democratic, the army came in. Turkey, sort of democratic, but it's got the army back in again. There's a whole variety of different areas where it's changing at the margin. A lot of these things are to do with Yeah, the Netherlands will be next. There's a whole series of places, undeveloped places like the Netherlands, who could do with.
We've obviously never really made it past the state of monarchy. You know, it's much like
much more
Much like Britain,
much more cosmopolitan monarchy than we do, much more democratic. But sorry, I've got to the point. But the main thing is that in all those places, that institutions are not developed enough, and that is a point. And there's a lot of places around the world. You go to India, you just watch Modi win there. It's no secret the Economist was not a great fan of Modi. But Modi, one of Modi's first things is he looked and he said, we've got to make India more like China. That actually is quite interesting. And there's a reason for that. If you were a poor Indian over the past 20 years, you've done worse than the poor Chinese. I should stress one thing, is that I think that you shouldn't look at it as kind of here's China and Singapore's following. It's exactly the other way around. Singapore is, I think, possibly the real Asian alternative. It's very small, but it is still remarkable how many things they do better than other governments. And a lot of it is due to a lot of Asian claptrap and Asian values. You push that to one side, there's a lot of really basic stuff about how do you run schools, how do you run healthcare, which doesn't involve any of the authoritarian thing. It's just simply they have thought about this stuff really hard. They spent some money on it. They paid their civil servants $2 million a year if they do good jobs. But they really made it work. And the result is a state which is roughly half the size of what you have here, but which delivers much, much better services. And so
do you think you can realistically scale that up to, a continent-wide?
I think you can't in terms of it's self-evident that Singapore versus California they're very different. But I think you have to be careful about just writing it off like that. A lot of things they do, yes, you can scale up. You could do many more. That's what people are looking at. That's the reason why the Asians are looking at it. But we bang on about democracy. Democracy was based around Athens, a city which is infinitely smaller than Singapore was. It went quite a long way. It's possible, I think, to take on all the good things about Singapore and just ignore the rubbish about stopping people eating chewing gum and spitting out on the street.
You were talking about the failed moves towards democracy, which have been really part of the scene since the year 2000. I think one of the reasons that this has happened is that people have assumed that what democracy means is just voting. Elections, that's all it means. And what we argue very vigorously in this book is that democracy is liberal democracy, and democracy needs a set of rules. It needs a set of constitutions that actually protect democracy from some of its worst instincts. And we actually think that, obviously, for example, giving independence to banks in the 1980s was a very sensible thing. To central banks, sorry, not all banks, to central banks in the early 1980s, because it really squeezed inflation out of the system. We actually think that you'd also need constitutional constraints. I think it'd be quite good to have committees of wise men and women deciding on long-term entitlement programs, on bringing budgets back into balance, because what we're doing at the moment is instituting a system of licensed robbery, whereby the current generation of people are robbing future generations of their future. And I think that these non-political, non-partisan policymakers should have a role in looking at long-term balances things. I think also in Egypt, again, the big mistake was just to think that all you need was one election once, and that's what you need. What you needed was to entrench the rights of minorities through liberal constitutions. So I think we've got a bit lazy about thinking about what democracy means, and democracy means a lot more than voting. It means a mechanism of protecting the rights of minorities, individuals, and indeed future generations.
So along those more technocratic lines, of course, there's a long history, say especially in the judicial branch. Do you see that as a model? We have wise men who are like judges, and then the people sort of sitting there saying
I think what you have to be very careful about using this model, that you don't push it too far, and that you don't start trying to hand over decisions that really should be made by voters to wise men. But I think there are problems with democracy. Democracy does tend to be short-term. It does tend to be a bit irascible. And I think injecting some sort of set of more long-term considerations into it, in exactly the way that the Scandinavians have been doing with their long-term pension reforms, is a good way of doing these things, because and indeed the Chileans have done the same thing. So when Milton Friedman and people in the 1970s were talking about expanding the role of markets, they were also talking about expanding all sorts of checks and balances on voting behavior.
And do you think that a setup like that, where you're basically saying, okay, these 5 people now have the power to decide for us. Do you think that a system like that appeals in a time of popular discontent
think-
and skepticism toward
I think at
the
the
people
moment,
lording over them?
I think at the moment, Colin Bowen could point out that at the moment people trust government so little. They have the numbers we were looking. It's the 50th anniversary, strangely uncelebrated. 50th anniversary of the Great Society. You look at the numbers, and trust in government now is so low compared with what it was back then, because people don't expect anything to work. So to some extent, it is a matter of leadership. It's a matter of people. It's a matter of people saying, well, actually, there's this problem. It's incredibly difficult. We will give it. I think 5 people sounds dangerously Olympian. It has to be something more than that. But it has something where people can come forward. Personally, again, Simpson Bowles was roughly in the right order. You see what happens in Sweden. We have got used. I mean, it's worth remembering. You go back and look about central banks. The idea that you have an independent central bank used to be anathema. Now people think that was a reasonably sensible answer to a problem. The same thing I think you could do with entitlements. I wouldn't say you prescribe everything to that, and you have to have some democratic check. But there are lots of other things you do to clean up democracy. You can introduce sunset clauses on all bills, so that why do you have an insane world where people, you look at the size of the state in America, it's not just regulation, not just the size of the state in terms of percentage of GDP, it's all the wretched regulation, which we have to be honest, or people in this room have to be honest, and say that the right is just as guilty of as the left. The left goes off and rushes to build prisons and hospitals, hospitals and schools, and keeps on asking for more regulations about how exactly this should be interfered and so on. The right is equally guilty about building prisons and armies, and also asking for a lot of regulations about how to stop people doing this or that. You have reached a mad world. We use Beatrice and Sidney Webb in our book. The founders of modern favoring socialism. Sidney Webb, not a terribly prepossessing figure, but he was the son of a barber, son of a hairdresser. Even he would be rather staggered that in Florida you have to go and spend 2 years training in cutting and blow drying in order to get a license to be a barber. And the idea when you spend 2 years in order to become a license to get interior decoration, if the AEI is meant to do anything, it is meant to destroy those regulations. Because whatever Leviathan was there for, it cannot be to stop people having clashing color schemes in their living rooms. That does not strike me as something which the whole point of the state. When we ask what was the state for, that is not a good answer.
I think I agree with that. I do feel that we started out at a much happier note than where we've arrived now. So I think I'm going to open it up to the floor to see if someone has
You've depressed people.
something
so
happy to say. Yeah. So there we go. Michael, yeah.
Michael Barone at AEI, originally of Detroit. India just had an election with Narendra Modi winning a parliamentary majority for the first time in 30 years. My recollection is that John Stuart Mill and his father, James Mill, worked for the East India Company.
Correct.
Yeah.
They applied their teaching more to the UK than to India, I guess. But what should India do in light of where we are now? And is there a place for in India for, and what's your opinion of the Bolsa Familial policies that have, that in Mexico, where mothers are paid money if they send their kids to get vaccinated and send them to school and so forth?
We've been sort of slightly negative in terms of the dysfunctions of government, and there's nowhere where being negative about the dysfunctions of government is easy than in India, because there's a huge mess there. But I think there are also some incredibly positive things going on in India. There is a huge number of private schools that are growing up to replace public schools, where people just pay a few rupees, many of them very innovative. I went to a hospital in Bangalore run by a man called Devi Shetty, and it's a hospital which basically tries to apply mass production techniques, economies of scale and scope, to heart operations. So it's a huge hospital with 1,000 patients, with incredibly rapid throughput of patients, and it basically charges people $2,000. Its unit cost is $2,000 per heart operation, compared with America, which is about $100,000. Yet, research by both Harvard Medical School and Harvard Business School found that this hospital is as efficient, as successful, it has as good survival rates as any of these hospitals, because basically it's using much speedier, much more intensity of labor, much more division of labor. So the heart operation, like Mr. Devi Shetty, concentrate only on the very high-end things that they can do. Everything else is done by assistants. So there are a whole series of reinventions of basic things like healthcare and indeed education, lots of use of the internet to bring education to people even in very distant villages. So in India, there's a great deal of great stuff bubbling up at the bottom. So what Mr. Modi should do, I think he should sort out the mess of India. He should introduce a bit more dynamism into it. I think he's right to say that China has been better on the infrastructure, and he needs to do that. But in lots of ways, he needs to sort of get out of the way and allow all these innovations that are happening at the state level and at the local level a bit more purchase. I think the easiest thing to do, actually, I think what would be an amazing change in India would be to introduce a voucher scheme. Because at the moment, you have a situation whereby people are paying through their taxes to send their children to public schools. The teachers don't turn up. 25% of all teachers at schools don't actually bother to turn up to school work. So people are just taking their children out of these schools, poor people, and sending them to private schools. If you actually gave them a voucher, that would, I think, stimulate an incredible education revolution.
The Bolsa Familia, the Brazilian thing, is a fantastic example of how, if you look around the world, there are really clever things in government. Just conditional cash transfers. If you're a poor mother, you will get your money if you send your children to go and have vaccinations, to go and have and to do school. That makes a real difference, and it's slightly the same in America. We again, this book, it is a positive book, very positive, because it says look around the states in America. You can see really quite clever things happening here. It's just in the middle, perhaps in Washington, where the problem is.
Sorry.
It's the other side of the room, isn't
Left and right.
Yeah.
Mark Lutter, George Mason University. So like you said, your book is very positive, and if I understand the thesis correctly, it's basically that fiscal imbalances in the welfare state will lead to a rethinking of the state along classic liberal lines. And it seems to me that there could be an alternative outcome, which is just that we hit the wall and then don't go anywhere. So you see lots of middle-income countries have good economic growth until they hit $10,000, $12,000 and just sort of stop. And so alternatively, we could see the Western world hit that, have some inflation to pay off these debts, and then just be stuck in the high regulation, medium inflation, stagnation, and have no change. And so why won't that happen?
You beat France, obviously. The answer is yes, that is possible. I think what you're seeing in Europe at the moment is a version of, I suppose, Japan-style stagnation. There has been a great tragedy in some ways. There was this chance to really open up Europe, and so far they have not grabbed it. And the irony is, you look at Angela Merkel, who I'd argue, my job is to run around meeting these people. Angela Merkel is, I would argue, the most impressive world leader today in terms of political nous. She is an incredible leader. She has unbelievably good political instincts, and she's fantastically good at assembling coordinations. She's amazingly good at destroying her enemies with effortless ease. But she has guided Europe.
Yes, exactly.
Someone's told me, she destroys people without them noticing. It's the ideal dream.
Really, what you want in a German leader.
Yeah, exactly. But when we look back at her in 20 years' time, just as I was rude about Barack Obama, people could look at Angela Merkel and say, look, here was this woman who had more power than any leader in Europe for a very, very, very long time, and yet she understood the problem. She was the one who said, here's Europe, which has, and it was at 7% of the world's population, 20% of its economy, and 50% of its welfare spending, and she didn't tackle that. And so I think it is, it will be difficult. So the answer is stagnation is an opportunity, but in the end, you have to come out and do something.
But on the stagnation point, it's absolutely a possibility. But one of the fundamental things that we see going on at the moment is a technological change, a technological revolution, which creates huge opportunities. In the 19th century, you had a dramatic increase in the productivity of the manufacturing sector because of the machine revolution. I think what we're seeing now is a dramatic increase in the productivity of the service sector because of the information technology revolution. And the state is inevitably a service sector, based sort of thing. You can improve all sorts of aspects of the state services dramatically. We will see that in the next few years. If you think of the classic sort of core aspects of what the state does, provides law and order. Well, we're seeing the police forces becoming dramatically more efficient. We're seeing crime rates dropping in Europe, in the United States, partly because you can find out where crimes are being committed very, very quickly. You can create hotspots. You can send police forces very rapidly to clamp down on these crimes. Or if you look at the second oldest function of the state, which is defense, you're seeing the arrival of drones, you're seeing the arrival of robots. I think now serving in the US Army are 12,000 robots ranging from tiny little insects to huge dog-like things. And I think you will eventually have probably the majority of people serving in the US Army will be robots. This is a huge productivity increase in the service sector. You're seeing in the education sector now a great star lecturer, the Isaiah Berlin of today, can lecture in a way that's really quite vivid to millions of people over the internet. The whole chalk and talk aspect of school teaching can be done through modern technology, through iPads, through computers, liberating teachers to spend their time giving personal tuition to their pupils. Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, actually gets his children's homework help through the Khan Academy, which anybody can access, but nothing. You see, in the medical world, the use of the Internet of Things, sensors which can be attached to people's bodies, telling doctors whether they're going to have a diabetic arrest or heart attacks, or you can have pill bottles which will glow to remind you, to take your pills if you've got Alzheimer's or things like that. We're really going to see a dramatic, technologically driven revolution. Now, countries don't have to choose to exploit those technological changes, but those countries that do will be able to reduce the spending on the state, will be able to improve the service they give, and voters will start noticing this. They'll start noticing other people getting better services for less money, and companies will start noticing this, so they'll start locating their operations where the state is working more efficiently. That's why we think this revolution of the 19th century, the revolution of John Stuart Mill, is so striking, because you took a dysfunctional, corruption-ridden, parasitic state, sacked it, replaced it with an efficiency, meritocratic-driven state, harnessed the new forces of technological change, and created a state that was cheaper and delivered better services.
Thank you. My name is Mikra of the World Bank. My question relates on a deeper level about the democracy as a system of governance. There seems to be an inherent tension in your suggestions on making the state more efficient and more democratic at the same time, because some of the examples you took came from some of the most paternalistic states in the world, like Sweden, Singapore, excuse me. You even mentioned China, how efficient it is in some of what it does, but they lack the mechanisms of a democracy like the United States and some of the Western European countries. On the other extreme, you have California, where voters legislate from civil rights to building bridges, and as a result, you've written before how a dysfunctional government it is. So how do you resolve that kind of tension, making the government more efficient, yet at the same time preserving the freedom?
Well, it is, I've noticed actually when we say things, you have people here shaking their heads occasionally, and the reason why I think amazingly is not because we don't believe it, is because basically you have known nothing else. Everyone in this room, no matter how old or young, has lived in a world where the ever-growing state has been, despite everything the AEI has tried to do, despite everything the Economist has tried to do, it's been the reality of your lives. And what strikes me is you can have two choices. You can either say, well, that's just going to continue, or you can go and look at history, which would tell you it's not going to continue because the West goes through these huge revolutions. Or you could look at technology and just ask yourself, is it really likely, really remotely likely, that the same winds that have swept through the private sector are not going to actually affect the public sector? And that strikes me as extremely unlikely. So in years to come, people may look at it very differently. On the answer of your question, yes, there is, as we point out, there is a tension in democracy. The famous quote from a European politician about, we know what we have to do, we just don't know how to get elected once we've done it. And that is the great excuse. And if we walked into any senator's office around here, they would say that. But against that, it does work in the end. There is, democracy is good at the end just about dealing with these things. It is much more flexible. And the answer again is back to example. You know what Adrian was saying. It's already changing. If you sort of look from the bottom upwards, people years ago had no idea how bad their schools were. Now, thanks to technology, you can look on the internet and just see that, you know, you can be in California and you can see that your schools are lousy compared with Finnish ones. They're actually really useless compared with Polish ones now, thanks to the PISA report. You can see you're spending more money, and most of it's going to the teachers' unions, and you're getting worse results. Well, it's not only you're getting worse results than the Poles, the Koreans, the Finns, and God knows who else, but you're also getting worse results than the people just around the corner in San Bernardino or in Riverside or whichever bit it is. And that is going to be a fantastic discipline, I think, on the public sector, and that is going to be democratic. You go to Sweden again, we're mentioning Sweden rather a lot, but people go and look at their hospitals. They publish all the results online. Why on earth doesn't it happen in America? It's a really obvious thing. Go and look and see how good your thing is. That creates pressure from down below. And you look around the world, there are beginning to be people who are forming, you know, Facebook, internet. These are putting pressure on regimes to change. So there is something quite democratic about change in the end.
I think the people of San Bernardino are
Yeah,
probably
San
glad
Bernardino was a very bad
they
example.
got a
I
positive
apologize.
mention here.
That's
impressive.
they're possibly the worst possible one to mention, you're right. Sorry.
You mentioned, my name's Mike Sohn, a concerned citizen.
Aren't we all?
Aren't we all? You gave a lot of credit to meritocracy, and the question how to achieve meritocracy historically the legitimacy of a government to do this thing has changed. Even in modern times, Yugoslavia has broke up into multiple states. Africa has created multiple states. The Indian Revolution, Modi is plagued very much with a red and blue type situation as to whether he's going to be in deadlock. And I just wonder if you view the great man of theory of history, the legitimacy of government history, to change the world the way some of the people have said, to prevent stagnation. Ayn Rand created a two-state solution in her book. Do you visualize we are going to have this in a calm evolution, or the revolution mode?
I think we do believe that leaders matter enormously, that you can have long periods of stagnation where everything seems to be locked in the old form. And then a good leader comes along, or an inspiring leader comes along, who's able to ask an important question. In our book, the important question is, what is the state for? And I do think at the moment, bold leadership could actually help direct the state in the right direction. And one of our great regrets is that we haven't had more leadership from the executive branch in this country, particularly over entitlements and public spending, particularly over Simpson Bowles, and attempts to introduce a sort of straitjacket to stop the state from growing more. So I think leadership really does matter.
I just have one thing. You have sometimes it may be that states need to change shape. There's a very sweet old country called Britain, which, if you look what's going to happen over the next 2 years, in 3 months' time, well, at the end of this week, you could find the United Kingdom Independence Party topping the European polls. Another 2 months, you could then find Scotland leaving the Union, which would be a good example for you of countries breaking up. And another maybe 2 to 3 years, you could find Britain outside the European Union. Those would be fairly dramatic things from a place which people don't expect much change to happen. It could be that some units are just weird. You mentioned California. You look at the map of Californian government, and it has to be. We talked about Jerry Garcia earlier. It does look as it's designed by somebody on drugs. It has sort of thousands of interlocking districts, very few of which make much sense. It has some cities with 3 million people, some cities with 55. This is not the way you would start designing government if you started from the beginning. So I think there may be some element of redesign involved.
Yeah, starting from scratch, it would look much more like Belgium.
Yes, Belgium's always the model.
The model to go for. Sorry, we're going to go back to the left.
You all mentioned technological innovation as one of the driving forces of the fourth estate, and the rise of e-government, whether that be information or services provided by local governments, municipalities to citizens, is a driving factor behind that as well. What do you make of failures such as, or initial failures like healthcare.gov as affecting the people's ability to trust in technological innovation that includes the internet?
There is a huge and long history of governments trying to introduce very ambitious IT changes and then becoming an absolute disaster and having a huge backlash. We pioneered that in the National Health Service. We did all of that stuff before you got into Obamacare with equally appalling results. But I think one of the reasons for this is that you have a very limited ability to attract talent into the public sector. You have a very limited ability to have variations in wages, variations in contracts. You have this sort of Fordist, early 20th century view that everybody should have the same contracts, that wages should go up in lockstep. And that means that you essentially cannot attract into a technology-driven sector of the economy the sort of people who go and work for Google, or the sort of people who go to work for Facebook. And given that it's all about brain power, if you're saying, well, you've got to have this pay and you've got to work for this number of years and you've got to sit in this particular office in this particular position, those people are not going to come there. So I think this technological revolution offers huge power to the state to improve its performance, but it also demands that the state has to leave the 20th century behind and enter the 21st century in terms of performance-related pay, huge variations in rewards, in payments, and a much greater ability to move between the public and the private sector.
Hi, my name is Trey Long. I'm an IT project manager at the DC Department of Human Services here
So
in the
you're to
district.
blame.
So I'm part of the team that administers the systems that determine eligibility and fight fraud for those programs. And I have a follow-up question about some of your points about future technology and the automation that's coming. And there's a lot of people who think that we're going to have smart and intelligent software that is going to be able to make decisions better than humans can make decisions. And lots of industries that we currently consider immune to automation and immune to globalization are going to completely disappear, especially the service industry. Like you were saying, there'll be more and more jobs that are replaced by kiosks and software and automation. And that's going to have a big impact on employment in this country and a lot of other countries. So I'm interested in your vision of the fourth version of the state. What is the role of government when, we just don't need people working as much as we used to need them? We've had this notion of job-killing innovation ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where new inventions killed an old industry, but there were always so many new jobs become as a result of that new innovation that we've always been able to kind of keep up and been close to full employment, within 10% or so people who want a job. Some people think that's going to change with this technological innovation in the next couple of years, the next couple of generations. So I would love to know if what your approach, what you're thinking that looks like in the future, and especially if this notion of basic income that's coming up in some countries like Switzerland, where work is no longer a requirement to get the basic needs of life. What you guys think of that as well? And thank you for your time.
It's a huge issue, and we had a big cover on it. In the Economist earlier this year about technology ripping through and changing jobs and services. And there's a lot of evidence. You look back at the Industrial Revolution, it took time. We all know the idea that people moved from the land and moved into industries. It took time for employment to catch up. Our guess is what will happen in services will be somewhat similar. There is just a lot of jobs which could get sort of automated, and particularly within the public sector. The public sector cries out for a lot of these sort of things to come in. So the answer is it will cost jobs. And that, again, going back to people who worry about the politics of it all, it is an issue, and you are going to ask questions about inequality, and there may even be, you can see some quite right-wing economists talking about the idea you will end up with kind of make-work schemes, particularly for people who haven't been trained in things, because that is possibly better than just sort of farming them out. But I think on the whole, my underlying, even Reagan-esque optimism, I think this generally comes through. On the whole, people have tended to always get the downside of these things. They tend to exaggerate the downside of them too much. There are industries which creep up in areas that people never ever imagined. People never imagined there'd be a video games industry. People never imagined there would be different things that come up through the middle. And that tends to be the way it works, but it does look tough this time. And the job if you want a sort of big vision in some ways, the old Herb Stein quote, which I would submit to everyone who's shaking their heads at different moments, the old thing about if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Well, I would submit that on two areas. I think at the moment, the current level of inequality cannot go on forever. It will stop. And that, you might argue, sometimes people have to deal with that. Every politician I go and see, from presidents across the world, they all say the same things. They're worried about the economy. They usually worry about government quite a lot as well. But then they're really worried about inequality, fairness, whatever they call it. That's the other big thing. So I don't think that can continue. And that may push people in a more egalitarian direction. But the other thing which cannot go on forever is the ever-growing state. You might argue one is Piketty, and the other is Micklethwait and Wooldridge. But and it'd be very good if our sales could be pushed up to theirs, but up to his. But there is a balance between that, which your question exemplifies, is that there are going to be a lot of people pushed out during this next phase, and a lot of rewards are going to go to people at the top in terms of what happens. And that will put some pressure towards egalitarian urges. On the other hand, there's the basic idea. People are going to keep on looking at the state and say, why on earth does our company work like this and the government doesn't? And so the idea that government is going to keep on going in the same way it is just strikes me as completely untenable. And like all these things, people have seen things like reinventing government back to Bill Clinton. We've seen all this stuff about technology and the state before. The whole lesson of technology is people always exaggerate the short-term effects and completely underestimate the long-term effects. And I think that is extremely likely with the state.
So in other words, this one's going to be kind of the same as all the other ones. It just might be a little more painful and take more time.
Yes.
Well, I think there is the sort of notion that some people have, which is the state can never change. It's just stuck where it is. There's the other notion, which you sort of outlined, that it can change, but this is going to be terrible because lots of people lose their jobs. I think what is absolutely certain is that the state is going to change in very dramatic ways because of this technological revolution that's going on. The consequences of it can't be entirely foreseen, except I think it will mean much better and more efficiently delivered services. But one aspect of the IT revolution is that there will also be a globalization revolution. We tend to associate the delivery of public services with the nation state. We think the nation state will look after all of the public services within its border. But I once went to something called Cisco East, which is the Cisco headquarters in Bangalore, in fact. And what they're doing in that place is they're offering healthcare advice over the internet. This is to demonstrate the power of their machinery, really, but over the internet. So people will have doctor's consultations. I watched somebody in Seoul, in Korea, having a doctor's consultation with somebody sitting in India, giving them advice on what they needed to do. They were running the sewerage system in Singapore from this place in India, providing information. They were running the bus service in Singapore, telling people that it's going to be 2 minutes or 3 minutes till the next bus was going on. They're all sitting there using the power of technology to deliver public services across borders. And again, the world will be a very, very different place in 10 years' time because of the incredible exponential growth of the power of new technology.
So you think everybody in the U.S. who wants a job will be able to get a job?
No, definitely not. I think you'd have to be even the most wild fantasist would never imagine that. There is a wind of change sweeping through services. The argument we're making is that just as one wind of change completely revolutionized manufacturing, another one is coming into services. There is no bigger home of services than government. So on the particular issue of government, we think it'll become more efficient. But there is going to be a lot of people, particularly middle-aged people, to be honest, who are not going to be able to retool. You can go look at, Germany seems to have this unbelievable talent, alone in the world, for taking elderly manufacturing workers and retraining them to become hairdressers, but nobody else seems to be able to do it.
And also a great apprenticeship program.
Exactly.
All right, if we have one more particularly brilliant question, who's it going to be? Maybe you guys can join.
Each ask one.
Let's do it over here.
Yeah.
Dan Lieberman. Yeah, if you look at the changes in state, you start, from the nation state, and then you go to a liberal state, and then you go to a welfare state, and you find that all these changes came about during a failure of capitalism, that the new state was recreated not only to repair the failures of capitalism, but to preserve capitalism. And you talk about technological change. Well, in the 1920s, we had tremendous technological change, and we had a depression afterwards. So why will it be different? Why will the next state not change for the same reasons that the previous states changed? In other words, to repair and preserve the capitalist system.
Well, I don't think the changes in the 19th century were about the failure of capitalism. They were about the fact that capitalism was actually growing very, very fast, and that it was being rather restricted in its capacity to growth by the fact that you had a state system which was known as old corruption, which was a rent-seeking entity. And they said, actually, if we're going to have a successful capitalist system, we have to have a sewerage system, we have to have a police force, we have to have a successful civil service. So it was really about adapting the state to the needs of capitalism. In the earlier 20th century, it was indeed, there were, particularly with the New Deal, a sense of the failures of capitalism and the state adjusting that. But one of the things that I think went really wrong here was the idea that the state had to be governed along very different principles from the market, that the state had to give people jobs for life, it had to have lockstep pay, it had to have a very different culture from the business section. I think it had to be, as it were, a counterbalance to the business section. One of the things I'd like to see is many of the virtues of capitalism and modern management, contracting out performance-related pay, and the rest of it imported into the public sector to bring the public sector up to the level of dynamism and creativity of the private sector.
Shall we do one last one? Laura? Yeah.
Thanks for taking my question. What I wonder is, with respect to that question about what the state is for, how much of a disparity do you allow in that answer between, rich countries and poor countries, countries in the West and developing countries? And if the answer is uniformly that the purpose of the state is to maximize liberty and efficiency, I can imagine that that might be a difficult, if you're China, that's a difficult answer to swallow. How do you reckon sort of those disparities, and do you think it's a uniform answer?
You're right, there are different needs, and I think here, liberty and efficiency would unsurprisingly be what we would accentuate. Actually, within China, I wish there was a lot more liberty and efficiency, because or certainly a lot more liberty. And we should say very clearly, we think there are huge problems, as you said, in what is going on in China. But there are different needs. But I think you should also think about it in terms of people having. There are different ways along the road. In some cases, people want a particular set of things. In other cases, people want a different set. There are some real advantages. Michael referred to some. There are some real advantages in starting with a tabula rasa. If you're India, you're looking at healthcare, you have a fraction of the number of doctors, a fraction of the number of hospitals. You actually have the chance to start doing things in a fairly dramatic way. We talked about technology. India has got this method of identifying people, which is just using high tech. That seems to be working pretty well, actually, unlike Obamacare, because it doesn't have to deal with all the assembled rubbish that's come before. There is an opportunity for poor countries to leapfrog in some ways towards things. So the answers are slightly different. But underneath it all, I think the Chinese model, much less extent than the Singaporean one, is about a very authoritarian version of the world. We think passionately that the liberal version of the world should work and that democracy should come, but it's not going to be. It's not as simple as just as it has been for the past 500 years, where one set of rules are going to work. This time there is a real competition, and our worry about America is it's not focusing enough on this global aspect of competition.
All right, and on that note, I think we're done here. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.